Rita and I are going to share this one. She's going to do the people's testimony, and then I'll pop in for the traditions.
There is a pain in this world that you can't be cheered out of. You don't need solutions. You don't need to move on from your grief. You need someone to see your grief, acknowledge it. You need someone to hold your hand while you stand there and blinking. Horror, staring at the hole that was your life. Some things cannot be fixed. They can only be carried. Megan, Divine, it's okay that you are not okay. So seek out to one another for love and comfort when they're in grief.
Thank you, Rita.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. You're going to see why maybe it was wise to share this one. There's a lot of fun names. This is Ruth 1, 3 through 5, and 19 through 22. Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So over the next few weeks, we are going to spend some time getting familiar with the story of Ruth. Now, there's a few reasons for this. First of all, the Bible was mostly written, overwhelmingly written, by men. And because of that, we have what one could call a disproportionate abundance of masculine perspectives and protagonists, as well as depictions of God. So when we get the opportunity to get insights on the feminine within Scripture, I think we need to take advantage of that opportunity. Because while it's disproportionately male, it does not mean that it's exclusively male. There's actually a lot for us to learn or to be familiarized with from the spiritual perspectives of our scriptural ancestors. And Ruth is one of those places. It's one of those books. Now, if you're like me, you hear the name Ruth, and you picture a person of a certain generation. I had a great aunt Ruth. She was 93 years old when I met her. And I imagine some of you have a great aunt Ruth, or a great grandma Ruth, or perhaps a good friend Ruth, right? And in my perspective, when I hear of the book of Ruth, there is a part of me that thinks of my great aunt. Like, what can I learn from this? Well, my great aunt Ruth was surprisingly assertive. And she has that in common with our protagonist that the book is named after. In fact, this book is surprisingly badass. And I bet some of the Ruths that come to your minds are or were too. So this is a short book, and it's one that's overlooked pretty easily because it's short. It's also overlooked by many pastors because it doesn't get very much focus in the lectionary, and also because, well, there's been a lot of dude pastors, right? And we easily skip over this. Just like when we tell the story of the birth of Jesus, it's very easy for us to focus on like how awesome Joseph was, right? And what did Mary do? Well, Mary was obedient, and that's why she's great. It's been in, the last 100 years, really, that we've had female pastors really show up and help us recontextualize the Bible, recontextualize the gifts that it has to offer us, and our understanding of ancient people, our understanding of ancient Christians and ancient Jewish folks. And there's some great things that I'm looking forward to spending some time in. We're going to get familiar with this, and even though this book doesn't have any battles, and there's no prophetic declarations, there is a lot of drama. And it's fun. It's fun to me to get into some of this ancient drama. It's also occasionally enlightening for some of the cringy elements of ancient society. And I've had people remind me, yeah, and some of it's not as ancient as we think. Like a world where men got to make all the choices. Wasn't that long ago. Certainly has persisted after Ruth. Our book was written after the Persians had freed Babylonian captives from a couple generations of basically being kidnapped and brought out of the land of Israel. When the Persians came in, they freed those folks. They said, hey, go back to Judea and Israel, and pay us taxes and be well. And so that's what the majority of the captive folks, we are told, did. But they now had this task of, remaking their society. And this is a tricky issue. How do you remake your society? Well, what should culture look like? Well, lucky for them, they have the Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And it says a lot about what they should and shouldn't do and the way a culture should work. It also says great things in there, like don't intermarry with the people who happen to be in the land around you. Don't you marry those Canaanites. Don't do it. Ruth throws a big old wrench into the works for any of us who think, well, that must be exclusively how ancient Jewish society worked. Ruth questions and deconstructs, not the person, but the book. So it takes place in the time of the Judges. And when you hear the Judges, I want you to think about the Wild West, okay? It is a time that wasn't nearly as long as it is in our public imagination or as pervasive. And yet, when we think of dysregulation, when we think of like the government not really having a say-so in things and people making the law up as they go, and thieves just running amok, and criminals not being held to account unless you've got some sort of vengeful, vigilante, we picture the Wild West. And for us, when we see stories set in the book of Judges or the age of the Judges, that's the kind of vibe we're getting. This is a time when government officials were on the take and the religious leaders were murderers. This is a time when your saviors were the judges, who were warlords who would rise up. And then your chief oppressors would also be the judges or their dynasties. Things would start off great, but they wouldn't last great for very long. People would forget. They would forget over and over what their priorities were to be. And set in this time is this story Now, we learned in the reading that there was this family. Naomi, the mom, she was married to Elimelech. Elimelech is a tongue twister of a name, and don't worry, he's not going to be on the test because he only is in this chapter. He's really not anywhere else. And they bring their 2 sons with them, and they have to leave. They have to leave Israel and Judah. Why? Why do they have to leave? Well, there is a fierce famine that's hit the land. And like some of our neighbors, they had to make a choice between staying in their country and likely dying, or leaving and surviving. And their kids having an opportunity to survive. So they go to Moab. Moab is one of those countries right on the border, and they've butt heads with the Israelites. They would go to war with one another. If you're going to Moab as an Israelite, it's because times are hard. And the city they're leaving is Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the city of bread. There's no food to be had in the city of bread, so they go to Moab. And they're there for 10 years, and things must be fairly good because the 2 sons, they get married. One marries Orpah, the other marries Ruth. But things must not be all that good because all 3 of the dudes in this family die. And Naomi is left in a desperate situation. What does she do? Does she stay in this land without the means of provision because she is a woman in a society where women have very few choices on how to survive? Or does she go back to the city of bread now that the famine is over, to people who knew her? Really, she's got to make a choice between begging in Moab or begging in Bethlehem. That's the situation she's in. And so she hits the road, and she goes with Orpah and Naomi. Even though she tells Orpah and Ruth, even though she tells Orpah and Ruth, don't come with me. There's no reason for you to come with me. I know that you're grieving the loss of my sons too, but you're Moabites and you're young. You could still get married again. Your families are around. You have a much better chance of survival without me. Go back. But Orpah and Ruth insist, no, we want to keep going with you. They must really love Naomi to be going into this country of national enemies to support her. Eventually, Orpah relents, and it's after Ruth makes a prayer on the road. She weeps, and then she prays heartbreakingly that these 2 women find security in the house of their future husbands. The prayer is for security. It's for provision. You know what the prayer is not for? Love. Or even happiness. She just prays that they're going to have provision, food, water, a place to sleep. Because, as she tells them, the future ahead of me, it's destitution. It's homelessness. So Orpah leaves after crying and giving her a big hug. But Ruth insists. Naomi says, you know, I can't bear any more kids for you, right? And even if I did, even if I could bear a son for you, are you going to hang out until they come of age? No. Ruth says, I'm coming with you anyway. Naomi says, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. I hate that line. I feel that line, but I hate it. Have you ever tried to encourage somebody who feels like the hand of the Lord has turned against them? Have you yourself ever felt like maybe God has turned against you? I want to tell Naomi, hey, look, people die sometimes. It doesn't mean that God killed them. Sometimes that's just what happens. But that doesn't change Naomi's situation at all, does it? She has a devastating future ahead of her, and she's going to live as long as she can beg. But Ruth is resolute. She's not going to abandon Naomi. She's prepared to follow this through to the end. She is also headed to the city of bread. She's going to cross the border as a foreigner, a Canaanite, an alien, somebody that the Torah, the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, tells Israelites not to associate with. A bad person, because she's not from that group. She's going to enter it as a Moabite into the land of people who hate and war with the people of Moab. And she's giving up a fairly certain future of provision with her own people. And for what? Why? Why do this? Because she loves Naomi. Ruth's words to Naomi are very popular in Christian weddings, but I want you to hear them given the rest of this context. Close your eyes if you're comfortable with that. Picture Ruth and Naomi looking at one another. They're on the road. They're getting closer and closer to Bethlehem. And Ruth looks into the eyes of beloved Naomi, and she says, "Do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." Are you picking up on the gravity of this scene? I love weddings. I do. And I don't fault anybody for using this line because it is a beautiful depiction of love and sworn fidelity to another person, which is also kind of a beautiful thing. Ruth doesn't have to do this. She's choosing to. She's choosing to be attached to Naomi no matter what, even if it leads to her death, and even though it'll lead to her death in a foreign place. But this is love in the midst of tragedy. This is love saying, I'm prepared to struggle and die with you. And this is how the faithfulness of God is seen in this book. How do we see God in this book? Only ever through other people. Through moments like this. Through a seemingly powerless woman, a foreigner, using what agency she has to walk alongside and love this woman until the very end. Well, Naomi and Ruth, they push on, and they finally make it to Bethlehem. And the women there, they see Naomi, and they say, "Is that you? It's been 10 years. Naomi's been through a lot." And she says, "Don't call me Naomi." Naomi means pleasant. I'm not pleasant anymore. No. I'm bitter. Call me Mara. Now, we've known a lot of people in our lives, I'm sure, in this room, who are plenty bitter. But how many of them would be like, that's my name now. Just call me bitter. She embraces it. I am bitter because God led me away full and has brought me back empty. The women hold space with her. We don't see in the story anybody trying to correct her. Hey, listen, don't impugn the name of God. God does good stuff, and you're blaming God for a bad thing. None of them are like, hey, maybe you deserve it, like in the book of Job, which you shouldn't get points for not saying to somebody, hey, you probably deserve the tragedy you've gone through. But given that the book of Job is like another one of these examples of immense suffering, I'm going to give these women some points for that still. I mean, I know a lot of people today who are still kind of quick to jump to that. They don't try to change her theology. They just sit with her. They let her share her pain. They just carry this moment. Now, do any of them open up their homes to her? Do any of them say, hey, we've got the stable you can stay in? No. I imagine because they probably don't have the say-so to do that. Really, if these women, Ruth and Naomi, were to get long-term shelter, it was only going to happen by either being accepted into a brothel, which does exist in the realm of possibility for them, or they've been married to one of these other husbands of these women, or they've been enslaved by them. Those are the three options. They can't do that. They don't do that. None of them go back home and say, hey, husband, you want another wife? Hey, my friend Naomi is here. We call her Mara now. I think she would make a great slave. No. But they do what they can. They just sit with them. They hold space. Sometimes life is like this, especially when our society is not set up for everyone to have what they need. We're often one disaster away from desperation. How many of us have been personally affected by houselessness, either ourselves personally or someone we love? I have. Yeah. And I imagine many of you watching this from home. I learned that my mom spent a good chunk of her childhood living out of a car with my grandpa and my grandma. Yeah. For a long time, she didn't want to go camping for some reason. Now she does, but my dad has to bring a little trailer. If you're in that position now, or if you once were, or you fear that you may one day be, I hope that you have some companionship in this story. You're not alone. Some of our greatest heroes of faith were impoverished with no place to lay their head. David, Paul, Jesus and the disciples, all were homeless. But just because there's companionship in our sacred text doesn't mean that the season of loss is any less painful or scary. It could be hard to imagine that things can get better. Pain makes us uncomfortable, even pain that we ourselves are not directly affected by. And so, because we're uncomfortable, we may find ourselves saying unhelpful things like, hey, this probably happened for a reason. You should focus on the positive. really wonderful cliches like this, like when we're in the season of loss, we may not want to receive, but those around us want to comfort us. So they give us a quick fix answer. We do, however, I think, need a space to share with others. Not to get answers, not to be fixed, not to have our theology changed. Even if it's theology that I think is toxic, that is not my opportunity to try to help somebody think their way out of their pain. My responsibility, our responsibility, is to do the thing that none of us need an expertise in. To simply sit and hold space with those who are suffering. And I find that freeing. I find that liberating. I mentioned Job's friends earlier. Well, when Job had lost everything, they spent 7 days sitting in silence with him. It wasn't until they opened their big fat mouths that he called them miserable comforters. I think that's instructive for us too. Giuseppe, this is all such a downer. The last line of our text says, "The barley harvest is coming." The barley harvest is coming, my friends. This situation is not going to remain static. We've got some good things ahead for us. And here in the first chapter, our writer gives us one little silver lining. Now, the rest of the story gets interesting, provocative, scandalous even. And that's going to be awesome to talk about. I'm looking forward to it. But in the meantime, I hope that throughout the week, we can reflect on how we can share space with other people. Or if we're in a season where we need others to share space with us, well, my prayer is that we can find such safe space with wonderful comforters. Can I pray real quick, and then we'll move into our responsive song? God, I thank you for the wisdom of the ancients. Even when I disagree, I learn so much from them. And it is a gift to have these real human problems presented before us. I ask you to help us as we go about our daily lives. Help us to share space with one another, with our neighbors, with strangers who may need it, and that we find such space reciprocated. In Jesus' name, amen.